The institution of written texts and documents is also an essential aspect of the governing of the polis, which requires possession of the knowledge necessary for prudent, just and wise rule. The great-souled man, Phronimos, possesses such knowledge. One important aspect of running the polis is care for those citizens who are disadvantaged in various ways, e.g. suffering from mental health issues. Without statistical data, it is difficult to know just how prevalent such issues were in ancient Greece. One assumes it was the medical profession of the time that helped these patients for obvious reasons, given the Greek view of sush, in which body and soul were so intimately related. Many but not all mental health issues begin with traumatic experience, which of course affects the normal functioning of the body in various ways. There were, during this period, no institutions for mental health care, as was the case during Freud's times. There is a suggestion in Plato that it was the family that took the major responsibility for patients suffering from serious mental health issues. We ought, however, to remember in the context of this discussion that institutionalization of mentally ill patients during Freud's lifetime could not be called either prudent or wise. We recall that whilst Freud was initiating his talking cure, literally thousands of women were being forcibly incarcerated in European mental institutions for hysteria, a condition that Freud, together with Joseph Breuer, would investigate using the so-called talking cure. Their treatment was dubbed the moral treatment because it respected the patient's freedom and wishes. The trauma hysterical patients experienced was not always remembered or even acknowledged by them as such, and Freud and Breuer therefore resorted to hypnosis to gain access to the traces of the traumatic experience. Hypnosis, however, proved not to be a viable technique because not everybody could be hypnotized, but also because the only treatment available was through post-hypnotic suggestion, in which the symptom would often disappear once the patient returned to consciousness. This was not a cure, though, because another symptom would just take its place. What was needed for a complete treatment was a state of mind in which the patient was conscious, but relaxed enough to gain access to unconscious memories with the help of appropriate techniques, such as free association and dream interpretation. The number one rule of the psychoanalytical discourse was that the patient honestly communicate all the thoughts they are having during the treatment period. The techniques used in these sessions also needed to identify the defensive resistances that prevented the unconscious material from emerging during these sessions. Consciousness, we know, is merely a vicissitude of the instincts, and it is used by the ego in relation to the pleasure, pain, and reality principles with a preference for the latter, especially when it comes to subjecting emotional gratifications and anxiety to the discipline of rationality. In this regulation process, it appears as if the mind is layered, and the lower layers do not easily manifest in consciousness, requiring therefore the above-mentioned special techniques if they are to be accessed: free association, dream interpretation, and managing resistances. For Freud, it was clear from the beginning of his theorizing that the unconscious was not a location in the mind, which was in many other theories regarded as a special kind of substance. Rather, the unconscious was part of a functional mental process regulated by the energy regulation and pleasure-pain principles. Freud claimed he was a Kantian psychologist, and it is against the background of this claim that we should seek to understand why he wished to use the term mythology in relation to his theory about the role of the instincts in psychoanalysis. Kant, we know, was engaged in a much larger metaphysical project, charting the totality of conditions for mental functioning. What Freud is engaged upon could well also be described as theorizing about the outer reaches of inner space. Interior trauma eventually expresses itself in outer symptoms, which are both bodily and behavioral. It is important in psychoanalytical treatment that the traumatic memory become part of a cathartic process which brings it into some kind of relation to both consciousness and to language. O'Shaughnessy, in his work, The Will, a Dual Aspect Theory, provides us with an account of the role of the body image in the context of normal action. The will, he argues, in its active physical projects involving the body, uses what he calls a projected body image, consisting of all of the parts of the body that are under the control of the will, to initiate the action desired. In seeing an apple and desiring to eat it, my arm and hand are energized for the reaching and picking activity, thus providing the necessary conditions for the activity of eating the apple. O'Shaughnessy is influenced by the writings of Freud. We are, O'Shaughnessy argues, mentally aware of the act of moving our arm, and this awareness is non-observational. It is an immediate awareness. These explorations are obviously relevant to explaining what it is that is happening when a patient suffering from hysteria suddenly cannot use their legs or their eyes. That is, cases of hysterical paralysis and hysterical blindness. Physical investigations of such paralysis and blindness reveal no so-called real cause, but there must be a cause nevertheless, and this must be similar to the causes that produce our imagined dream images, imagined actions, and imagined sensations. The dreaming mind is to some extent a deranged mind, operating in extremely unnatural circumstances, and this is also true of the hysterical patient's mind. The relation of the body image to the hysterical mind is, of course, not a normal one, and perhaps what is creating hysterical phenomena is more closely connected to dream mechanisms and phenomena than to normal mechanisms and phenomena. O'Shaughnessy is also critical of some of Freud's positions. He claims, for example, that instinctive drives are not for Freud connected to representations. This criticism may have been true of Freud's very early materialistic theories, but it is not true of the later theorizing where Freud is insistent that he is dealing only with the psychical representatives of the instincts which otherwise for him, as is the case for Kant, are an unknown X. Schopenhauer's account of the will maintains that the will is independent of representation. Perhaps the best way of conceiving of Freud's position philosophically is through the lens of Aristotle's hylomorphic theory. Instincts for hylomorphic theory would be matter that is organized by certain principles that typically operate in the realm of Sush, but they can also in their turn be regulated by other principles and become vicissitudes of instincts, e.g. consciousness. Now my awareness of the movement of my arm may be instinctive, but it is a form of knowledge of myself, and some form of knowledge of myself is also going to be operating in my consciousness of myself as thinking. Campbell argues that the images of mythology come from a conflict among the organs of the human Sush, and the most dramatic examples of this phenomena come in the form of dream images when we are seemingly woken suddenly and seem to remember walking down some steps and missing a step after perhaps falling asleep in a very tired state. This phenomenon may have been produced by the life instinct in an emergency response to the organs of the body, including the breathing responses of our lungs, shutting down too fast and too completely. This image, like all dream images, has the function of trying to keep us asleep. Here the conflict is seen clearly. Now, dreams do not normally connect to the transcendent dimensions of our existence in the way in which myth does, although Carl Jung maintains that the dreams of individuals, in the later stages of the self-individuation process, may relate to the transcendent and the infinite more directly. Campbell believes that many narratives of mythology connect more directly to the metaphysics of nature and the metaphysics of morals than is the case with our Christian narratives. The growing trend of secularization and atheism indicates, however, that our Christian religion is not providing us with meaningful symbols. Campbell argues that now that we have the knowledge of the universe that we do, and have walked on the surface of the moon, looking at our planet from outer space, we have to develop a mythology that relates to our planet and its place in the universe. This is not an easy task, given the facts that our planetary system is merely a series of specks in the galaxy, which in its turn is but one galaxy in an almost inconceivable number of other galaxies. Narratives normally possess the telos or purpose of celebrating our lives on this planet, celebrating the power of being human in response to the powers of nature and space. The Greek and Shakespearean genre of tragedy, when performed on a stage, as a visible spectacle may, however, be the best we can do in the form of acknowledgement of the power of nature versus the power of man, who, as the Greek oracles claimed, is destined for ruin and destruction. The proclamation from the same oracles to know thyself may also be the registration of an ancient preliterate wisdom, which respects that aspect of nature that is beyond human control, for example, a huge asteroid impacting the Earth, a large volcano erupting and exploding, a large devastating earthquake, constant heavy rain for a long period of time, etc. Having watched men walk on the moon was significant in many respects, but perhaps its primary significance is in the realization that should something cataclysmic occur on our planet, there is at least the remote possibility of starting again somewhere else. So perhaps our modern mythology might create narratives related to the problems of moving a civilization to an inhospitable environment. The heroes of such narratives would obviously be scientists and engineers, as long as the cataclysmic event on Earth was not of the scientists' making. If, however, the weapons of mass destruction, which they have invented, produces a cataclysmic event, they will be held responsible for destroying what took tens of thousands of years to create, and will in Jung's terms be manifestations of the shadow of the Sush. The shadow, for Jung, took many concrete forms of monsters and demons, and was seemingly less abstractly conceived than the Freudian death instinct which was related to Thanatos of ancient Greek mythology. Campbell, in the context of this discussion, notes that contemporary popular themes of concern are health, progeny and prosperity, and these seem not to acknowledge the possible tragic fate of mankind, and also do not seem to acknowledge the second coming of the Saviour as prophesied by our Christian religion. In a chapter of this work entitled Cosmology and the Mythic Imagination, Campbell once again takes up the Apollo mission and its use of what he claims is Kantian a priori knowledge of the laws of space. The laws of space are known to the mind because they are of the mind. Outer space is within, inasmuch as the laws of space, known by NASA, are within us. Outer space and inner space are the same. We are, he claims, born out of the space containing our Sun and our Earth in a galaxy formed long before we were born. Our Earth is, on the galactic view, merely a satellite of the Sun. We are creations of this Earth. Our eyes are of this Earth, and our knowledge too belongs to this Earth, which is a creation of space. Campbell refers in the context of this discussion to the Atlas of the universe. Our universe, he claims, is a universe of unimaginable magnitude and inconceivable violence. In it billions of thermonuclear furnaces are scattering from each other. Some stars are blowing themselves to pieces, littering the universe with dust and gas from which new stars and their satellites are being born. Add to this the traces of microwaves we have discovered, remnants of a huge explosion circa 18 billion years ago. We can then begin to understand why scientists wish to speak about a space-time continuum, in which they claim we are seeing the traces of an event that occurred eons ago. Space, time, and matter are for Aristotle and Kant, in their constitution, infinite, but it is difficult to believe that either philosopher would have claimed, as some scientists have, that the universe came into existence with this huge explosion. They would undoubtedly have agreed that this explosion carried an important cosmological significance with it. Both philosophers, in all likelihood, would have been more inclined to side with Ovid's account of the universe, for which there might have been no beginning, merely a chaos of elements which Deus brought into order by sending all the elements to their places. For these philosophers, anthropomorphizations of God or the gods would have been essentially contradictory, since Deus for them was something abstract like the laws of space/time/matter/sush. Sush, according to Plato, Jung and Campbell, is the location of concrete elementary ideas or archetypes which, if the circumstances are propitious, we can recollect. For Campbell, mythology contains the images of deities which are local forms of the elementary ideas and archetypes. He further claims that the mere contemplation of these elementary ideas and archetypes sends us into a state of ecstatic rapture. Kant felt awe and wonder at the mere perception of outer space and the thought of the moral law within, and Aristotle probably felt the same in relation to the thought of the infinite and prime form. Campbell also points out in this chapter that the book of Genesis in the OT is merely the local and tribal mythology of one of the peoples on earth, and does not therefore meet the criteria of universality and necessity sought by, for example, the philosophers. He does not specifically say so, but he probably means to level this accusation of perspectivalism at Greek mythology. Concrete images such as the gods living on Mount Olympus would appear to support his position, but we ought also recall that Zeus and the pantheon of the Greek gods replaced the earlier mythological figures of the demiurge, the Erinyes/Eumenides, Eros, and Thanatos. The proclamations of the oracles seem indeed to predate the later mythology relating to the war between the gods and the Titans. Campbell claims that mythology is essentially trying to reveal what is transcendent and metaphysical in our existence, and we should not therefore fixate upon the concrete manifestations of these symbols. In this context, we ought to realize that mythology is an art form, and as such is presenting elementary ideas to audiences aesthetically. Now, Kant has pointed out that both universality and necessity were involved in aesthetic judgments and activity, but in a subjective form. The particular province of mythology appears, however, to incorporate knowledge of the transcendental ideas of nature and the transcendental ideas of the power of being human. The sublime is, then, an important focus for mythology, and the communication of sublime truths may have been one of the tasks of the ancient Greek oracles, e.g., everything created by man is destined for ruin and destruction. Campbell, in this context, points to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD. God's chosen people had their city, their temple, and the Ark of the Covenant destroyed. He wishes to point to such events as illustration of the fact that the laws of man and his cities do not elevate them above nature, and that we should always bear in mind that different mythologies are there to curb the hubris of man by reminding us of the relativity of different deities and lifestyles. The invention of writing was, of course, an important cultural event that allowed mythologies to be written down and preserved for the attention of future historians. Around the time that writing and mathematics was being invented, priests were curious about the immensity of the heavens, which could not be explored by earth-bound beings such as us. This awe and wonder was then sublimated by the invention of mathematics, which attempted to find a means to measure space and time, and thus project human ideas and numerals upon space and temporal duration. Numbers were obviously related not just to space, but also to time. As a result of this invention and its projection, the heavens began to become associated with almost inconceivable magnitudes, and events occurring in the heavens over time also appeared to manifest regularities that symbolized the transcendent and the metaphysical. Numbers became thus associated with sacred properties, especially when particular numbers began to appear in cultures as distant as Iceland and India. Darkness is the prevalent property of the universe, and light is a secondary phenomenon generated by thermonuclear reactors, stars, but in spite of this fact, it is light that is associated with the good, and darkness with evil, especially for those forms of sush possessing the power of vision. These visual properties of darkness and light have no particular meaning for plant life, which does not possess a visual system. The light and darkness for plant life are stimuli that produce not pictures of reality, but only a chemical reaction. Campbell claims that the Nietzschean proclamation that God is dead was only directed at the jealous, angry gods of different tribes, and he also claims that we moderns have left these gods behind for experiences of transcendence. Now, Kant certainly experienced and theorized about transcendence, and found a place in his life world for the sublime and the sacred. We moderns of the 21st century, however, appear too preoccupied with our technological gadgets to search for the mysteries of life in our secularized societies. Campbell claims the following: God is the infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. This is a fine characterization of the infinite universe, and also accounts for the fact that every local image of God is one among millions possible. Mythological places may be symbolic, but they may also be actual. Heaven and hell are obviously symbolic, sublime, and dreaded places located in the inner space of man's sush, which may then be projected upon real geographical places, such as the heavens or the bowels of the earth. We need to understand, Campbell argues, that when the Bible claims that Jesus ascended up to heaven, this event really did not take place as described, and we are dealing with something metaphysical and transcendent. In this event, what we are witnessing is the retreat of Jesus as a real figure from outer space into our inner space. Hinduism has its pantheon of deities which include Brahman, Atman, Indira, Vishnu, and Shiva. In one of the Hindu narratives, Indira believes he is the only god of the universe, until Brahman informs Indira that it is rather he, Brahman, who will foresee the dissolution of the universe, and that Indira is but one of a very large number of Indiras. The hubris of Indira is thereby neutralized. We are also introduced to Atman, that part of the individual sush that is a part of Brahman, and therefore eternal and unchangeable. The Buddhists deny this because for them there is no constant essence of the soul. Both religions, however, believe in resurrections of the soul, which compromises any notion of life that maintains that it is of the essence of life to come to an end in death.